present in person and those of us joining online. Now, I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce our speaker for today, Professor Junko Habu, Tomoe Takahashi Endowed Chair in Japanese Studies, Chair of the Center for Japanese Studies, and Curator of East Asian Ethnology and Archaeology of the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology, University of California, Berkeley. And she's also an affiliated professor of the Research Institute for Humanity and Nature in Japan and steering committee member of iHope Network. And she's indeed for Yokohama herself, graduating in archaeology at Keio, and then moving on to doctoral studies at McGill's and completing the PhD, and the same here, joining in the Department of Anthropology at Berkeley. An anthropological archaeologist, Professor Habu has been pioneering historical ecology research on food and subsistence diversity, social networks, and the resilience of socioeconomic systems over the long term down to the present. Leading and advancing interdisciplinary research on cultural change among Jomon hunter-gatherer, covering a sweep of well over 10,000 years, Professor Habu is currently directing several projects on top of running an exciting lab, laboratories, mentoring students, and whatnot. These include also work on the agroecology of present-day rural communities and the importance of traditional and local ecological knowledge. In between, she's also examined the impacts of the Great East Japan earthquake in 2011 and the Fukushima nuclear accident. Prolific and wide-ranging in the field as much as on paper, reaching out different audiences of the several books, articles, and other publication outputs, Cambridge University Press monograph, Ancient Jomon of Japan, and a more recent co-edited volume, Handbook of East and Southeast Asian Archaeology, are reference readings in world archaeology teaching. And if I can pick and choose, I dare and mention the Kyoto 2016 Agroecology Declaration, the outcome of a fruitful discussions Professor Habu initiated with agroecologists, physicists, national and private stakeholders, local rural communities. Now, this declaration is guiding agroecology-based food systems in Japan. We are extremely grateful and delighted to welcome Professor Habu here. The floor is yours. You can share your screen now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Federica. Let me share the slide. Okay, how does this look?
Very good, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your kind invitation, Federica and Nick. It's my great pleasure to be here and give a presentation titled Historical Ecology and Changes in Jomon Landscape Practice, Examples from Northeastern Japan. Now, as Federica kindly said, I'm very interested in the intersection of archaeology, ethnography, and agroecology, but it took me a long time before I got to that point. And it is closely tied to the history and the current situation of Japanese archaeology. So first, I want to show you a little bit of a background and then talk about my transdisciplinary projects at the Research Institute for Humanity and Nature in Japan. And then talk a little bit about what I'm learning from the collaboration with agroecologists and other scholars in different fields. So I'm interested in the study of hunter-gatherer mobility, landscapes, environmental knowledge and material culture, from which we can think about the redundancy of the use of different places, how different temporal and spatial scales can be used to think about long-term sustainability and resilience of human cultures and societies. I work on the Jomon period, the prehistoric hunter-gatherers in Japan. And in doing so, I've been using historical ecology as my main theoretical framework. I believe the majority of you who are here today know a lot about historical ecology, so I won't go through the textbook definition of that. But for me, some of the attractions include it covers both history and ecology. Sometimes my students and I discuss whether we can find theoretical compatibility with some of the models and discussions that we use in historical ecology. I'm very interested in the impacts of human activities on the biosphere in relation to biodiversity. The concept of landscape is very important, with a focus on soil, vegetation, plant succession, and of course, fire. We are learning that in understanding long-term change from the past to the present, the role of traditional ecological knowledge and the materiality and language are all tied to human environmental interaction, and how human environmental dialectics can be observed at multiple temporal and spatial scales. And often what we are learning is what looks like a good idea in the short term often backfires in the long run. That said, as an archaeologist, we really feel that the concept of longue durée can really help us think about how historical ecology can be used in archaeological studies and how archaeological studies can contribute to the current discussion of environmental issues. I'm particularly interested in the importance of food and subsistence diversity. For the past several years, I'm getting more and more interested in the implications of environmental management and how people who tended to think that agriculture was the major revolution, maybe that is not really the way to look at history. Certain types of environmental management was as influential for the long course of human history, and really trying to think about an alternative ways to emphasize agricultural revolution. And that also leads to really see history from a non-linear view. And working on Japanese archaeology really helped me to move research towards the direction that I just described. In Japan, archaeology is considered to be a part of history, and it's considered to be the study of our own ancestors. And because Japan has the law for the protection of cultural property, which really defined that if a known archaeological site is about to be destroyed, a rescue excavation needs to be conducted, whether it's a private land or public land. And the entire area that are planned to be destroyed need to be excavated. So in terms of the aerial coverage of excavation, it's 100% excavation. Because Japanese archaeology started, well, after the Second World War, Japanese archaeology had a new start in which archaeology played a critical role to really understand what happened in the past, as opposed to emperor-centered historical view based on mythical understanding of the origins of the country. Archaeology as a science had a really political implication. With that, many archaeologists really emphasize the importance of community engagement and public outreach. And as a result, there's a strong support from community members and local residents for archaeology. One advantage about Japanese archaeology is really you can see a lot of continuity in landscape practice from the past to the present. And rich ethnographic data from rural parts of Japan can really help us understanding human-environmental interaction. Now, that said, history of Japanese archaeology after the Second World War is also closely tied to the history of its rapid economic development and recession. Pretty much whenever a bullet train line construction plan is there, or freeway construction or dam construction, oftentimes a rescue excavation needs to be conducted. This is an example of a rescue excavation prior to a bullet train line construction. Now, if you look at this diagram, you can see that the number of rescue and excavations went up quite rapidly from the mid-1970s to the mid-1990s. At the height of the number of rescue excavations, it was over 11,000 per year. And it came down after the Japanese economy started to decline, but the number is still quite high, around 8,000, 7,000. And it means that Japanese archaeology developed along with the rapid land development during and after the 60s. And I grew up with that. I was born in 1959, and by age 10, I was picking up shell fragments near my parents' place. Here's me at in the 4th grade. This is me standing on top of a pile of bulldozed archaeological site, picking up some Jomon potsherds. By the late 1970s, rescue excavation system became much more organized, and this kind of destruction without any excavation stopped. This is me, I think the freshman year of my Keio University period, excavating the Isarago shell mound. And by 1985, Japanese archaeologists began to systematically excavate more recent archaeological sites, including historic Edo period site, the samurai period. And this is an excavation that I conducted on the campus of the University of Tokyo, 17th to 19th century samurai residence. Even though rescue excavations covered all the way from the Paleolithic to the recent historic period, my major research interest was always on Jomon, especially from the early to the final Jomon period, about 7,000 to 2,300 BP. And the Jomon people from the early to final Jomon period are often called as complex hunter-gatherers, associated with production and use of pottery, large settlements, shell middens, ceremonial features, food storage, high site density, and long distance trade. And if you classify hunter-gatherers into 2 types, generalists versus specialists, Jomon, early to final Jomon, are generally classified on the side of the specialist, with more sedentary lifeways, storage of staple food, and active environmental management. When you look at Jomon changes through time during the Jomon period, I suggest that a major change occurred at around the transition from the initial to the early Jomon period, when starchy plant food became staple food in some parts of the Japanese archipelago, initially acorns and chestnuts, and slightly later buckeyes. And I think this change was at least as important as the introduction of rice and millet in the following Yayoi period, because the shift to starchy plant food as their staple really changed Jomon people's mobility, subsistence strategies, landscape practice, and most likely social organization as well. So this change in the food systems from generalists to specialists with a heavy reliance on starchy food, possibly also tubers such as warabi bracken and lily tuber. There's some possibility of millet cultivation, but it doesn't look like it was an important part of the staple food. I think this was a major, major change. And when I think of this, excavated acorns and buckeyes become quite common during and after the Middle Jomon. What's interesting is that that shift occurred at around here. But when you look at the population estimate for each Jomon subperiod, the population estimate comes down. And this has been a big enigma for many scholars working on the Jomon period. If you look at the demographic data on the Japanese archipelago, this was the first time that the population on the Japanese archipelago decreased fairly radically. And there were only 3 more times: the Heian and Kamakura period, the medieval one, and the late Edo period, and today. So you can see that this was a major historic change throughout the history on the Japanese archipelago. And I started to think, now, if the Jomon people shifted with more subsistence intensification, most likely with a focus on a particular type or types of staple food, loss of food diversity, and larger scale food production or food acquisition. Today, we know that problems of large scale production for mass consumption is vulnerable to climate change and disasters. And I started to ask, did we have something similar even in the prehistoric period? And this led me to develop a 3-year transdisciplinary project at the Research Institute for Humanity and Nature in Kyoto, titled Long-Term Sustainability Through Place-Based Small-Scale Economies. And this was a 3-year project with 3 components: the long-degree group, Archaeology and Paleoenvironmental Studies; Contemporary Society group with a focus on ethnographic studies; and the Implementation, Outreach, and Policy Proposal group with an emphasis on the resilience of small-scale, place-based economies and the importance of traditional ecological knowledge. So this project questioned 2 commonly accepted assumptions from an ecological perspective. The first assumption is to be questioned is that large-scale production is more efficient. This is directly tied to the question of scale. And the second question is homogenized production is more efficient. This is tied to the question of diversity. We started with a hypothesis that highly specialized subsistence strategies, i.e. low food and subsistence diversity, can support a larger population for a short period. However, a decrease in food and subsistence diversity makes society more vulnerable in the long run. The project was divided into 3 groups, and each group had 2 subgroups. One group focused on northeastern Japan, and the other group focused on comparative studies, primarily from the other side of the Pacific Ocean. Same for the other 2 groups. Now, I don't have a lot of time to go through the details of individual sub-projects, but here I want to show an example of our archaeological case study. This one shows our data analysis at the Sannai-Maruyama site, early to middle Jomon period. It's the largest Jomon settlement. Rescue excavation was conducted prior to a planned baseball stadium construction, and it turned out to be a really important archaeological site. And local people took pride of the fact that this important site was found in their hometown, and eventually the governor of the prefecture decided to preserve the site. Today, it's one of the 17 World Heritage Jomon prehistoric sites in northern Japan. The site is associated with more than 600 pit dwellings. Now, it's an interesting site that it's located at the edge of the Aomori Plain. It's a lowland site. Compared to many other Jomon sites, this is rather an unusual location, and I'm going to come back to this issue a little bit later. The site currently looks like this. When we looked at the Sannai-Maruyama data, we noticed that changes through time over the 1600 years of the site occupation is actually quite interesting. And we see changes in the number of pit dwellings that were occupied, went up, down a little bit, went up very quickly and down, and a little bit going back, but at around 4400 BP, the site ceased to be occupied. And these dates were obtained through our projects. And before that, many Japanese archaeologists have suggested that the end of the Sannai-Maruyama site occupation was tied to cooling climate, the 4.3K event, the Bond event. But what we noticed was that the decrease in the site population started at around 5,000 BP, so 600, 700 years before the Bond 3 event. We also noticed that if we look at stone tools as a reflection of subsistence strategies, we see major changes in tool assemblages. Initially, the site was associated with many flake tools, including stem scrapers and arrowheads, tools that are most likely associated with fishing and hunting. And then gradually we start to see an increase in grinding stones, shown here, which we think were plant food processing tools. And then we have several phases associated pretty much, well, I won't say pretty much, but dominated by grinding stones. And that abruptly ended around here, shortly before the number of pit dwellings started to decrease. So as you can see, initially with lots of flake tools and then grinding stones, the domination of grinding stones, and then all of a sudden they're all gone. So if we look at stone tools as a reflection of change in food and subsistence diversity, then we can interpret this data as that change in the loss of food and subsistence diversity occurred first, followed by a decrease in settlement size. This was also associated with a decrease in the number of clay figurines, which we think are associated with a particular type of rituals. So this result is consistent with our hypothesis that loss of food and subsistence diversity led to the reduction in settlement size and changes in rituals. Now, the types of plant food that were important at the Sannai-Maruyama, there are a lot of debate, but one possibility is chestnut. That Professor Tsuji and his group suggest that the Sannai-Maruyama people up to the middle of the Middle Jomon period were heavily relying on chestnut. And at the Sannai-Maruyama site, around the village was an extensive chestnut orchard, which was surrounded by the secondary vegetation and the deciduous forest. Now, if you look at the pollen data at Sannai-Maruyama, it's not as clear as I want, but this is definitely a possibility. But it also raises a question: if there was this level of major environmental modification, how did it affect the stability of the ecosystem around the site? Related to that is a question, getting back to an earlier issue that I mentioned, that Sannai-Maruyama is one of the few Jomon sites that are located in the lowland area. That anybody who are working on Jomon period know that the majority of Jomon settlements are on top of hills. And the Aomori Plain area and its surrounding hilly area is a good example that for the early Jomon sites, pretty much all the settlements, apart from Sannai-Maruyama and Chikano, which is really an extension of Sannai-Maruyama, all the other early Jomon settlements are on top of hills. For the Middle Jomon period, there are more Middle Jomon large settlements coming down to the lower level, above sea level, between 13 and 20. And towards the end of the Middle Jomon period, right around the time when Sannai-Maruyama was abandoned, then the terminal phase of Middle Jomon sites start to go back to the hilly side. So these are all the interesting patterns that we are finding when we look at archaeological data from Jomon. I think what we are learning is that on the one hand, Koyama's population estimate of the Middle Jomon being the peak of the Jomon population throughout the Japanese archipelago, the big pattern at the larger scale makes sense. But if we look at smaller scale, localized scale, we started to see various patterns, and also changes through time is also showing a lot of up and downs. These are two examples of the results of some probability distribution analysis that Dr. Enrico Klima did for with our project. And it's showing a decrease in the Kanto region, starting at around 5,000 calibrated BP. For the Aomori area, it's not as clear, but the end of the Jomon, Middle Jomon period probably coincides with this. Statistically speaking, it's not clear. There are a number of sample size issues, but we started to see a lot of variability, but also general patterns. Now, this made us think, to what extent the Jomon people's subsistence were closely tied to mountain resources. And this led us to excavate another settlement in the Aomori area on the mountainside, the Goshizawa Matsumori site. We excavated one pit dwelling, and the site was also associated with multiple storage pits. This looks more like a typical Jomon settlement with interesting plant assemblage, including chestnut, walnut, little bit of buckeye, and a lot of lacquer tree seeds, toxicodendron. And this really made us think, how do we compare Jomon sites on the hilly side, and to what extent Jomon subsistence in general are tied to the mountainside, and how Sannai-Maruyama can be compared with many other Jomon sites. In order to pursue these questions, ethnographic work in our small-scale economies project were extremely informative. I'm going to show you a couple of examples of ethnographic work that we did with the project. This is one of the examples along the Hei River Valley in Iwate Prefecture. We also did some ethnographic work in Joboji. Now, the Hei River area is part of the Kitakami Mountain. Our ethnographic research indicate that food diversity with a wide variety of wild food from the mountains is quite noticeable, and many of them overlap with archaeological plant remains that we find from Jomon sites. Here, what's interesting is that you see staple food diversity is quite clear, and farmers and residents in this area had multiple backup plants. Their main agricultural practice is the cultivation of barnyard millet, barley, and soybeans. But that wasn't good enough. So as a backup plan, they use slash and burn agriculture with buckwheat, foxtail millet, and beans, etc. But that still wasn't good enough. So people stored acorns up on their ceilings of their houses. And that was the case up until the 1960s. Food storage was, of course, quite important, and social networks were critical as part of the support system. When we look at this list, this overlaps quite nicely with Elizabeth Colson's work. It can be interpreted as staying at the R phase of the resilience theory's H-shaped figure. In her case studies from Makar and Gwembe-Tonga, she emphasized the importance of multiple backup plans, including diversification, food storage, information of farming food, conversion of surplus food into durable variables, and social relationships. Looks like what we found in the Kitakami Mountain area matches really nicely with what Elizabeth suggested. As you can see, the importance of food and subsistence diversity and traditional ecological knowledge in this area, we can still see that elements of what has been transmitted among the residents is still there. And younger people may not make food like this, but the general idea of preserving food, they may use large freezers, or they may use electronic tools, but we can really see that the general elements are still there. It's also important to see that food storage and sharing food with the other community members are also quite important. And their cultivation of certain types of mountain veggies, such as warabi bracken, this is more like environmental management as opposed to typical agricultural practice that you can think of. So the main results of our ethnographic work at the Hay River Valley was that food and subsistence diversity supported by traditional ecological knowledge plays a critical role in the resilience of food systems and communities. And traditional ecological knowledge and local networks have been important, especially in the case of flood, typhoons, and earthquakes. Of course, efforts to revitalize the areas through farmers markets and local products. These are not easy, but people are trying. And depopulation is a serious problem today, but as many people were afraid of about 20 years ago, many scholars said that, well, these villages will disappear in 20 years, but that didn't happen. Large-scale land development plans with anticipated serious environmental damage is threatening small-scale food producers, but there are also a lot of movements by small-scale farmers and young people to revive small-scale food production. What's interesting about this area is that when you look at the vegetation, you can also see evidence of repeated clearing and the regeneration of the deciduous forest. This is cedar, which is replanted after a small patch. But as a whole, this is one of the areas that deciduous forest is still kept. Another field area that the small-scale economy projects members worked is Joboji in Iwate Prefecture. Here, lacquer sub-collecting to produce lacquerware, like miso soup bowls. This is one of the very few areas where you can still see the lacquer sub-collecting. And it's a really labor-intensive work. And this is incorporated as part of the common subsistence practice in this area. And historically, this area can also be was also characterized by multiple backup plans supported by wide subsistence diversity and traditional ecological knowledge that are critical for systems resilience. This one shows changes through time in subsistence strategies in Joboji based on ethnohistorical data. And you can see changes through time in lacquer production are quite evident, but it's part of the larger cycle, how that was combined with forestry and agriculture, and that today people are trying to revive the lacquer sub-collecting and lacquerware production. In terms of outreach, basket making workshop that we did at the Ainu Museum in Shiraoi was really one of the highlights of our project to emphasize the importance of TEK and rituals. This we did with a Suquamish elder, Mr. Ed Carrier. And there he said that 80% of basket making is really to get raw materials. The actual basket making and weaving, that part is only 20%. And getting raw materials starts with planting trees in the forest. And that was a beautiful example of how material culture is tied to the broader landscape management, and how that also requires a long time that you can't plant a tree and try to make basket in the next day, that you do need to have long-term plans. Now, in the process of wrapping up the project, we started to work very closely with agroecologists. This was originally one of the many sub-projects in the project, but toward the end, it became very clear that agroecologists and archaeologists could offer a lot to each other. We had an agroecology workshop right after the basket making workshop, and there making fertile soil requires long-term investment on the basis of traditional ecological knowledge was emphasized. I think one of the agroecologists said 80% is really to make fertile soil. Another point we said, well, 80%, we've just had a number in another workshop. And we've learned that agroecological practice is the intersection of traditional ecological knowledge and scientific knowledge. And the TK is always changing. And it's very important to maintain sovereignty and food self-sufficiency. And in order to do that, it's very important to maintain biodiversity and subsistence and crop diversity. One of the things that some of the project members in the agroecology group emphasized was the importance of environmental management in rural Japan. Japan is a country where slash and burn agriculture has a long tradition, and it was frequently practiced up until the 1950s. And in some areas, it is still practiced, though the number is getting very small. This is an example that one of our colleagues, Professor Hitaka at Ehime University, provided us. And that agroecologists are also very concerned about the decrease in farmland during and after the mid-1950s. This diagram shows how urbanization accompanies a decrease in farmland. And if you remember the number of excavations in Japan, that goes the other way. So you can really see that the development of rescue excavations was really coinciding with this trend. Loss of biodiversity in forests, grasses, insects, etc., is also an important problem. And the shift to the monoculture of rice has been a big issue that has been discussed by many agroecologists. Here I'm showing two photos from Myanmar. It's a suburb of Kyoto City, Kyoto. And it looks like a very nice rural landscape. But if you look at the picture carefully, the background is all cedar trees that are the monoculture of cedars and the rice paddy field. That is not necessarily the traditional Japanese style of what we call Satoyama, the human managed environment. Agroecologists also warn that after the 1960s, energy input versus output in rice farming in Japan is not in really good shape. If you think of energy input versus energy output after the 1960s, we're putting more energy into rice cultivation as opposed to the harvest. Now, depending on how you draw this line, the actual turning point may shift. But this diagram really shows that the so-called green revolution with more chemical fertilizer, pesticide, high-tech equipment, and fossil fuels, that is leading to less efficient agriculture in terms of energy input versus output. And one of the things that Japanese agroecologists are really trying to do is how can we bring this back to more agroecologically sustainable practice with a focus on traditional ecological knowledge, possibly the use of fire, crop diversity, and biodiversity. So with all these in mind, one of the things that the agroecologists in our team are doing, excuse me, is to think about the question of resilience, not in this H-shaped diagram. I know that this has been used by many people and it has its own utility. And in terms of thinking about long-term, large-scale changes, this may be useful. But when we think of smaller scale resilience of rice paddy field, crop fields, or local area, they suggest that going back to Holling's original idea of multi-stability may be more actually useful. But this one diagram is taken from Holling's and others' Panarchy book, but the original idea was already presented back in 1973, in which different types of resilience, different types of stability of ecosystems are shown. That when you're doing agriculture, we do know that nature flat, nature balanced are not really the case, because agriculture is always impacting the environment. So it's not neutral. Human impacted environment is what we are dealing with. And in there, what can we do to think about long-term resilience is really to have multiple backup plans, like Elizabeth Colson said, and just like what we observed in the Hay River area. So how do we see this model? This is what we've just published in a Japanese booklet, and Professor Hitaka created this diagram that multiple stability with multiple crops and different types of ecosystems, this is much more likely to be more resilient compared to just focusing on single type of agricultural practice, monoculture, or even forest management. With that in mind, when we think of the Japanese landscape, I'm also I need to wrap up soon, so I'm gonna hurry a little bit. A lot of people think that Japan is like Tokyo, big cities. But when you look at the map of Japan, 2/3 of the country is covered by the forest, 3/4 of the land is hilly and mountainous. So actually, many agricultural practice in the hilly side and mountainous side, you can still see a lot of traditional practice. And with that in mind, we started to look at the data that we collected in our small scale economy project and reviewed some of what we see and started to think about how can we combine the ethnographic data with archaeology and agroecology. Getting back to that Hay River Valley, we see that this is one area that deciduous forest is still there. A lot of what we see is can be really tied to the discussion of resilience. The Joboji area, we talked to several lacquer sap collectors that how lacquer sap collecting is so closely tied to the rest of their subsistence practice. One of the things that they're concerned about is the shortage of lacquer trees. That this is, as you can see, it just basically you place a cut mark, get a tiny, teeny bit of lacquer sap. It's not like maple syrup. It's a very labor intensive work. And currently they are doing more lacquer tree orchard, which seems to be a good way, but it also increases the possibility of ecological issues that if you have many lacquer trees together like this, then that increases the possibility of disease. Now, interestingly enough, Jomon people also made lacquerware. This is one of the oldest traditions. The technique goes back to about 9,000 years ago. And the lacquer layers on wood container and basket, the technique is pretty much the same as what we see. So we really began to see if Jomon people were making lacquerware, how did it affect their subsistence strategies? How did it affect their overall mobility? And to think about that, one of the possible sites that we can really link to our understanding of this area is a Goshono site in Ichinohe town, the photo that I used for the poster. Very quickly, our project also looked at several examples. This is an example of small-scale farmers interviews in Fukushima, led by a group of Fukushima University scholars. And here we do also have archaeological data from the prefecture. We also talked to people, Ainu people in Nibutani in Hokkaido, where landscape data are quite abundant. And finally, getting back to my hometown in Yokohama City, it's close to the ocean. It's a shell-midden area, but if you look at the actual ethnographic and ethnohistorical data, it wasn't the rice paddy field dominant area. Rice paddy fields were only in what they call the Yato erosional small valley. The majority of the agricultural practice was millet and active use of forest resources. Today, it looks like this, but when you start to look at what's there carefully, you can still see the remnant of landscapes, and with lots of ethnographic data. We can really start to link archaeological data with ethnographic data and potentially with collaborations with local residents. So with all these works, I really began to think archaeology, agroecology, and ethnohistory should work together with an emphasis on long-term perspectives, signatures of human actions on landscapes through the analysis of material culture and environmental data from the archaeology side. Agroecology can be the intersection of TK and scientific knowledge, and ethnohistory can really tell us the importance of multiple backup plans at the time of disasters and the resilience directly linked to memories and material cultures. And by collaborating with these other fields, we can really start to think about long-term continuity in landscape use in terms of the structure of systems resilience. In conclusion, archaeological sites are part of cultural landscape, and examining continuity and change in landscape practice will help us understand the resilience of food and socioeconomic systems in the past, present, and future. Questioning the conventional image of staple food in Japan, that has been suggested by many prominent scholars such as Yoshihiko Amino, but archaeologists haven't been really playing important work. But we can really move the discussion beyond the dichotomy between rice farmers in the lowland versus non-rice farmers in the mountains. There's possible importance of cultural fire from the Jomon period on. We have lots of charcoal. Very few people have worked on it, but we've been talking about it. And the use of fire for the environmental management up to the 1950s for agriculture and forest productivity can be really informative to think about environmental management from the past to the present. We really think more collaborations needed between archaeology, agroecology, and ethnography, ethnohistory. And more collaborations are needed with local stakeholders. And through that, we hope that training the next generation of scholars in transnational and transdisciplinary context. Okay, so that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. A round of digital and physical applaud for you, Professor Habu, for this very stimulating and thought-provoking. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. I don't know if anybody is already ready to pose a question. The floor is open, and hopefully Nick can also enable the chat. Thank you, Nick.
Chat is enabled if you don't want to ask your question publicly and you want us to read it out or to just post it. Yes, so the floor is open also here. If there are any questions in the room and online.
Shall I start?
You go ahead, Federica. Yeah.
I just take the liberty as a sort of chair. Thank you, really. A lot to digest and to think about. But I wonder if you could perhaps spend a few words on whether you think there is a relationship between developing sort of multiple strategies and longevity, biophysical longevity and cultural longevity in Japan. I'm also coming from a lot of what you said resonate with things that I've observed in part of Southern Mediterranean, and as you are aware, there are a lot of parallel research happening looking at longevity of people in certain rural areas. I'm actually also from Sardinia. Yeah, can you perhaps comment on, from a biophysical but also a cultural point of view? Thank you.
Okay. Well, in terms of understanding the cultural longevity, it's a tricky question because a lot of people say that in Japan, the traditional ecological knowledge or traditional lifeway is gone. That Japan is not what it was 40, 50 years ago. And that's one way to look at it. But if you talk to local people and what they are still doing, even if they say that they don't like traditional ecological knowledge or they don't like traditional practice, they store food. One thing that we were all impressed was that if we go to rural parts of Japan, pretty much every single household has a huge freezer in which they store wild veggies or deer meat or whatever they harvested. And then they freeze and they sometimes ship them to their relatives in Tokyo. And if a disaster hits, then that's their backup. That there was a big typhoon that hit that area in Japan in the year of WAC in Japan, so that was 2016. And during the WAC, the TV news was really telling us, what's happening, people in critical danger. I was more worried about the people there than what was presented in the conference. And then one of my friends posted on his Facebook, he was an ethnographer saying that, well, he was worried, so he went there. People are fine. People gave me bottled water. People fed me. Why did I go there? They are actually giving me more than me giving them. So in that regard, it's a delicate balance. If the westernization keeps going on, they may disappear. But at this moment, the style may be different, but the basic function is still there. And that is not only cultural issues. They may not be even aware that it's more of the practice. It's more of the traditional practice. It's not even knowledge that how they did. And it's really embedded as part of their practice, which I thought was quite interesting. In terms of biodiversity and physical characteristics, what's interesting is that when you think of slash and burn agriculture, what we learned was that it was popular, it was quite common up until the 1930s. And then when commercial industries came in, that became less common. So like charcoal making or cutting down chestnut trees for railway tracks, things like that really stopped slash and burn agriculture. But after the Second World War, that came back because people are so short of food. So that was still the backup plan. Today, it's not really a backup plan, but burning became a little bit more common for the production of warabi bracken to make warabi mochi, which is kind of a delicacy that it wasn't made with warabi for the past several decades, but now people started to look at real warabi mochi. So with that, ironically, burning the field is coming back. Now that I realize is not really the same as slash and burn agriculture putting back into practice, but things keep changing the form. But what's also clear is that because the Japanese economy is shrinking, or at least the recession keeps going on since the mid-1990s, with the disparity between the rich and poor is widening. Younger people are not necessarily happy to be in big cities. It's still a small number, but there are a group of people in Kyoto when I was running the project who said that if they want to live in downtown Kyoto, $2,000 is not good enough. But if they want to live in the suburb of Kyoto, then $1,000 is good enough to have a decent life. So it's currently it's a still small amount of people, but I think the shift can be seen. And I think it all depends on what will happen next and what kind of challenges we face.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, lots of food for thought. Anyone from the room, maybe, or online? Enrico, please.
Hi, Junko. Thank you so much for the talk. It's very nice to catch up on your latest research. And I have a question about over specialization during the Jomon period. And
Okay.
So my impression looking into later period, which I wasn't familiar until very recently, is that even during Yayoi period, there's not such a over dependence on rice. There's actually still a diverse system strategy. And of course, if you look at present day over specialization, there's a component of market economy, and we all know how things work from that standpoint. So bearing that in mind, what do you think was the push or pull factor that led into that over specialization in Sannai-Maruyama?
Well, I would like to say that, or put this way, I don't think that was the first time they tried. I think the first try was probably the latter half of the early Jomon, when you start to see an increase in population and then a little bit of decline. And I think they learned from the first round of a problem and they developed a solution. And I think, as Sandra said, a solution is always a problem. And I think in a way, I think the early to middle Jomon was the Jomon people's effort trying to make things more efficient, to move more towards the K phase from the R phase. But it always comes with problems. And in my previous presentation, I indicated the possibility of initial social stratification in the latter half of the early Jomon period, because that's the more easiest explanation. But I think with Wengrow and Graeber's book being extensively citing my Jomon book, I may have to come up with an alternative explanation. I think the majority of Japanese archaeologists feel that Jomon didn't really have strong social stratification, and that part I think is fine. But was there the emergent social inequality starting in the early Jomon is a question. It doesn't have to be a social stratification per se. It could be more need for more elaborate rituals or extensive earthwork and things like that, that people needed to kind of make their subsistence strategies more efficiently so that they can do more work. That I think is an alternative explanation. And for the early and middle Jomon, I think both can be a possibilities.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. We've got time for one more question.
Yeah.
I think Bill
Yeah,
has
Bill
a question.
Bill Ballet, please.
Yes, Junko, thank you very much for that excellent presentation. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you. Thank you
Sure.
for coming.
Yes, of course. I wouldn't miss it for anything. I have been reading Graeber and Wengrow also, and I was thinking about that during your presentation. I've read their extensive citation of your work. And the perspective they put it into, of course, is that you have monumentality at Sannai-Maruyama, but not stratification, you know. And I find that similarly with the geoglyphs in the Amazon region. There's no central site per se, and there are more than 460 of these. They're the size of football fields. In Europe, they're called enclosures, and they're metrically beautifully designed in terms of circles, squares, rectangles. You know, they understood what a 90-degree angle is. They understood issues like circumference and so on. And they had great engineers, but there's very little pottery associated with these. And some people think that the main site, which would have taken quite a big labor supply to make these massive mounds and mazes of earth, would have been a river. And these are meandering rivers in the area, and that therefore the occupation site could have just been washed down to the Amazon River out to the Atlantic Ocean. But I just thought I would mention, since you hadn't mentioned it, I was going to say that Graeber and Wengrow cite your work very heavily, and it is in this light. And I think that you're right. I think it's you don't need a stratification in terms of personages who have unequal access to resources, you know, the way the old stadial theories have it, like band, village, chiefdom, state, but rather that they're practicing standardization of their subsistence, but they're doing this in accordance with some kind of, you know, unwritten rule to which they believe. And I think it's a belief system in a hierarchy that is not necessarily visible, that they are, you know, to them, that they are aspiring to in making these gigantic and geometric configurations. Just a comment, but I really like the paper. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I was in Mexico last week, and I was looking at some of the archaeological sites, which really made me think of how to look at monumental architecture and features from various angles. And for Jomon, compared to what I see with Jomon, we do have some monumental architecture and features, but the scale is different from like a Chinese Neolithic, say, for example. So clearly, whatever Jomon had is very different from the Chinese Neolithic type of the things or Mesoamerican examples. Now, that said, I think one of the challenges of working on Jomon data is because we do have so many excavated sites, in a way, we can really see variability and anomalies, and it's getting, I think it's a fascinating part, but it's also, we started to see that what you see in the data, population increase and decrease, once you start to look at local changes, really it's a cluster of many local changes and changes through time. And I think that's where, like with one scale of analysis, you get certain patterns, but when you actually dissect the data, then you start to see that, well, that's kind of a superficial pattern, and it's a combination of this and this and that. And I think once we start doing it, how to look at the local changes or even at the site level changes, and then integrate them into the larger scale changes. And I think that's where historical ecology can play a role, but at that point, the picture will be much more complicated. So with this, Sannai-Maruyama, I know that we are running out of time, but Sannai-Maruyama is a tricky site. And I presented it as over-specialization, but in fact, in my first analysis of Sannai-Maruyama, I really emphasized that changes in site functions through time was significant. And once I started incorporating that, then the over-specialization discussion may apply only for the first half of the occupation. And at that point, the story changes quite a bit. So I don't want to deconstruct my argument here, but you can really see that there are still multiple ways of interpreting it, but at the same time, in the big picture, I don't think what I said is too far off from what was happening. So we can just keep looking at data, and I'd love to have your help, all of your help, and comments. So.
Thank you. I've seen that John has just posted a question for you in the chat. I don't know if anybody was booked before, maybe from the room. No? So maybe you can then address. John, would you like to unmute and ask yourself? Thank you.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Hi, Junko. Thank you for a really good talk. I really enjoyed it. Good to see you.
Thank you.
I was thinking about the way that they farm here in England and the way that they farm in America, and thinking, if you want to change things, you have to talk to agribusiness farmers and government policymakers, because it seems like they're really the immovable object. Have you tried that at all, or are they interested?
Yes, our group, the Agroecology group, has been working very closely with government policymakers and also agribusiness farmers. In fact, there's another project at the Research Institute for Humanity and Nature that work more closely with agribusiness farmers. Our project was more interested in the intersection of ecology and food production. But that said, yes, the issue is that some of the agribusiness people are putting too much emphasis on organic farming per se, not necessarily landscape management as a whole. And some of the agricultural practice, it's organic, but putting a lot of external input still, which is not what we want to do. The government policymakers are pushing that type of organic agriculture, which is slightly different from our direction, but there are quite a few number of people who are interested in what we are proposing. So it'll be interesting that at Berkeley, we are a minority, but we are not a complete minority. That probably about 60% of the people say, well, homogenized, larger scale food production, we do need more food. But about 30 to 40% say, no, we do not need more food. We have enough food, the distribution is unequal. So more of when grow and grabers perspective. So I guess that will keep going on, but I think the 3/11 earthquake in 2011 changed the mind of some people. I thought it would change the mind of the majority of the people. It didn't change the majority, but I think more and more people are aware of the problem of the growth model, that Japan can't continue to stick to the growth model, and Japan still has what it had, but if we don't do something, it'll be lost. And at that point, the self-sufficient rate in Japan is 40%. So if Japan cannot import food, then we are stuck in 2 weeks.
Thank you. It's interesting. I think it's clearly a long, slow conversation because, for example, the government in America and in Britain also is tied very closely to a specific model of agriculture. And but maybe if it works in Japan, then they might start to listen here. So good luck with it.
Well, we'll see. We are still a minority, but not completely a minority.
Thank you.
Thank you.
At least you have a regulation that requires that you can dig on any development field, which is, I mean, from a Mediterranean or European perspective, is just warring, really. I think we're running quite late. If there is any last minute, very quick question, I'm happy to ask Professor Habu to take it. Otherwise, I know it's been a long day and she's also on a different time zone. And
I'm actually in California, so it's 9:20. It's fine.
Okay. So I'm glad you made it. You made it back to the right time zone. So if there are no sort of pressing last question, please, another round of applause for a very, very stimulating talk. And thank you so very much.
Thank you very much for your comment.
May I also remind all of you, please come and join us next week and think about biocultural heritage with Professor Anneli Ekblom speaking to us from Uppsala University, giving us an African perspective on biocultural heritage. Thank you, everybody present online and in person. I think those in person will share a glass of wine. Yeah, have a great rest of the evening. And thanks again, Professor Habu, for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's great.